Good afternoon, folks. We are here on World War II TV again in the middle of Pacific Week, and it's an interesting story today, and it's one that some of you are probably quite familiar with. So, the death of probably the most famous Japanese admiral of World War II in 1943, in the same area we were talking about on yesterday's show with John McManus. We were in New Guinea, where we're in the same area, Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, a few months later this time. And tomorrow we're in the same area again. We've got three historians on from different parts of the world, one in Brisbane, one in Dallas, one in London, and me in France, talking about Section 22, the Australian countermeasures to Japanese radar. So all these shows, in a sense, link up. But right now, I'm going to introduce you to my guest. He's a professor of journalism in Boston, author of several books, Mr. Dick Lehr. Good afternoon, Dick. How are you doing?
Good, Paul. Thanks. Hope you're doing well, too.
I am indeed. So this story, I mean, in my prep for this show, the internet is full of stuff about Operation Vengeance, Yamamoto, the men involved in this mission. Books were written just after war. Books are still being written. There's magazine articles. It's been covered by kind of aviation buffs. It's been covered by, regular, ordinary kind of press. You're a journalist. Why did you want to turn your focus on this particular story? What was the hook for you?
I think there are several hooks, actually, Paul. The first had to do with, my father was in the Marines and stationed in the Pacific near the end of the war, and he was stationed on Guam. And like so many veterans, he didn't ever talk much about the war when I was growing up. So there was a little bit of curiosity about that part of the world, the Pacific and the Pacific War, that played into this. Because I am not a historian or even a World War II history buff of sorts. And even though, as you say, so much has been written about what's become known as Operation Vengeance, frankly, until a couple of years ago, I hadn't heard about it. I didn't know of it. I didn't know about Yamamoto. And a friend of mine, another author friend who had written a book called Lost in Shangri-La, also set in the Pacific, was telling me about it one day, this amazing World War II targeted kill in the Americans getting the Japanese icon, Admiral Yamamoto. And when he was done telling me, I was like, wow, what an amazing story. And not surprisingly, I start going online and I start thinking, maybe there's a book. I see that while there's been magazine articles written in the past few years, there hasn't been a book in a long time. So I started to think book, because that's what I do. I realized there's plenty been written, and I start reading into it. And I started to think, okay, am I just going to be retelling a story that's been told plenty of times before? I don't want to do that. So one of the things that came away from the reading that I did do was that a lot of the oxygen gets taken up with the controversy surrounding who exactly shot down Yamamoto. And that's an important question and an interesting question, but I felt overshadowed in that controversy was the mission commander, Captain Johnny Mitchell. So that was my first kind of thought, like, wow, I don't think Johnny Mitchell's gotten his due. So I started to want to focus in on John Mitchell as the mission commander, as the leader of this historic moment in the Pacific War. And I wanted to develop it in a way, journalists think in terms of storytelling and narrative. I wanted to think, bring something new to the storytelling, and not just tell an operation story that's been told before. And so I wanted Johnny Mitchell to come alive, to be my focus. But to make that happen, a historian or a writer like me, you got to get lucky in the sense that, I saw that there's been plenty out there about John Mitchell, but I need something special. So I tracked down his surviving daughter, who lived outside of Chicago, and also his surviving son, who lived in Southern California. And I reached out to them a few years ago, explaining what I was hoping to do. But to make it work, to be able to launch this, I said, did your dad ever write your mom letters or anything like that, or keep diaries? And John Mitchell's daughter was actually initially perhaps a little bit coy, a little bit reserved, and said, yeah, he wrote a few. And I go, oh, wow, that's great, because that's the kind of raw material a storyteller could really use. Can you share one with me? And so she Xeroxed a couple letters and sent them to me in Boston. I opened him up. He's got beautiful handwriting, Johnny Mitchell does, literate and well-written letters. And one of them happened to be on the Friday before the mission. And he's writing to his wife, Annie Lee, saying, I think I'm coming home. And I just knocked my socks off, saying, wow, he thinks he's coming home. And by the end of that afternoon, he's tapped on the shoulder and we have something special for you. So I got real excited. And I called the John Mitchell's daughter back and said, this is great. This is the kind of thing I'm looking for. Are there any more? And she goes, well, there's several hundred. And I just almost fell off my chair. And so not surprisingly, I took a plane out to Chicago, met with them at length. They just opened up their, her father's materials to me, shared everything. And that became a big, piece of it. And in other words, being able to tell this story, hopefully in a new and different way, focusing on the mission commander, but also making these characters come alive through the letters. It becomes a love story of sorts. Because through the letters, I'm able to track Johnny, not only his whole life, but especially when he became a pilot, his training in Texas and then California, meeting they're so rich in material and humanity in a way that you don't often get from simply reading, mission reports or something like that. So that became, to me, a big way to hopefully distinguish a retelling of this historic mission.
Well, and I think what's interesting as well is that sometimes we've talked about it on other shows, coming at a subject kind of fresh is actually the best way to do it, because there's lots of baggage. We do shows about historiography and how over the years opinions change about certain people who participate in World War II, and indeed information comes to light. We didn't know as much about code breaking, for example, when people wrote books 50 years ago as we do now. Yeah. So in some ways, you have a better arsenal available writing a book today in the early 21st century than you did writing it 40 years ago. So coming at it fresh is very interesting. And I'm intrigued. Well, we will talk about later, of course, about who the various theories of who got Yamamoto, and we'll get to that bit later on. And it is interesting, but as I agree with you, it can be taking attention away from what's important. We've done shows about certain German tank aces who got knocked out in Normandy, and people still debate who got them. And the point is, does it really matter? The point is that battle occurred, and the battle was an Allied victory, and that is the story, not necessarily who got who got, because the men at the time didn't necessarily care who got who. They just wanted to go home alive. And I think where your book, I read your book a few weeks ago, where you cover the letters, it's understanding the motivations of human beings is more interesting than did I get the admiral, did you get the admiral? That's just detail anyway.
And in my mind, hopefully every new book, hopefully my book, I see this, as building on the backs of the previous books. Taking advantage of new material or new resources, or a fresh take based on these family letters that have never been tapped before by any of the historians who have written about this. Some of the histories being really helpful and really informative, building blocks for me.
Yeah, indeed. But we haven't yet mentioned Yamamoto. So again, as a journalist, you've tackled some pretty meaty characters in your writing, from criminals and killers and
serial killers.
So Yamamoto, he's been written about a lot, but you said, coming to him fresh, he is a fascinating figure, because he, on the one hand, he kind of represents everything that is Japanese about the Japanese in World War II, if that doesn't sound like a weird sentence, but at the same time, traveled to London, knows, speaks English, traveled around the USA. He's a paradox in that sense, in that he is a worldly guy. So when you came to him fresh, how did you find out about him? You got the letters to understand Johnny Mitchell, but Yamamoto, with a lot of primary sources being in Japanese, how did you get honed in on his personality?
And again, you start out with, probably the cliche or the stereotype. I was assuming, because he's, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, that he was this sort of evil genius. just evil to the core in a way that Hitler was. And in fact, in studying the coverage and the journalism, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor and for decades, especially in the next year to come. I mean, Yamamoto was demonized. He was there's a famous cover of Time magazine in which they played with his image. There's that you're showing now, but there's even one that shows him to be a real devil, an Asian devil, on Time magazine. Again, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack. And I think what was fascinating, interesting in terms of research into Yamamoto was that his whole philosophy in terms of building up the Japanese Navy as the commander-in-chief of was as a deterrent effect. He was not a warmonger. He wanted to. It's almost it foreshadowed almost the nuclear arms race of our lifetimes or my childhood and whatnot, which was a sense of building up the nuclear arsenals and mutual assured destruction, so that there's parity and everyone is kind of frozen in place. And I think the more I dove in and read about Yamamoto and researched again, whether it was translated biographies or work done by English-speaking historians, was that he really saw this as a way to prevent war in terms of building up and staying on the cutting edge. I mean, he was an advocate of aircraft carriers and of fighter planes and seeing the sky as where is the battlefield of the future. But back in the 30s. But it was all about as to maintaining, I think, power for Japan. It's certainly in the Pacific, but not conquering the world. And so he was really up against it in terms of the whole internal politics, military politics of Japan, especially in terms of the army as being very, very aggressive-minded. And I found that fascinating. So you get that in terms of his military thinking and his philosophy. I think hopefully emerges in the portrait that I've painted of him in the book. And then the other thing was, again, as you said, things keep popping up over time that help add to the picture and the understanding. And he had a lover for a good part of his adult life, certainly. During the war years. And she was interviewed and there were letters that have, bubbled up and emerged and been translated. And they were enormously valuable to me, in the context of the type of story that I was looking to stake out, which was to really cast these two competing figures. And that was part of my narrative structure, almost dueling biographies.
Yeah.
Johnny Mitchell, the killer and the killee, and Yamamoto, but to not have them be stick figures, but have them be, full-bodied human beings. And you get that from Yamamoto in his letters to Chiyoko, his geisha, his mistress.
Yeah, and I think, we've talked about leadership a lot on World War II TV recently, and I think the tendency today is to put everybody into a pigeonhole. People are good or bad, or they're warmongers, or they're pacifists, or whatever. And most of these figures that we write about from World War II, Montgomery, Eisenhower, Patton, Yamamoto, some of the German Rommel, they're multifaceted human beings. Putting them on in a single category is too restrictive. They're, we can despise some of what Yamamoto did, and at the same time appreciate that he's also a different type of humanitarian in some sense. We don't have to put a complete label on him. And I think that's what your book does well, which is to kind of paint him with a broad brush, so that some people will read the book hating him. They will hate the Japanese. They will hate what the Japanese did in World War II. And you're not going to change those people's opinions. Other people will read it and go with an open mind and say, okay, I want to learn more about this figure I've heard about. And that's perfectly fine. It's okay to divide people over these people. They are very, very interesting people who affected huge drama in the war. So therefore we can, if people want to be angry at some of them, that's okay. It's interesting. But the point is you do try and give a balanced view of things. But so that's our protagonists. We have Yamamoto and we have John Mitchell. Let's talk a little bit about the Pacific Theater, because we are doing this in the middle of Pacific Week on World War II TV. So as we always have to remind ourselves, the Pacific Theater is a massive, massive place. I mean, we think about Europe being big, but the distances here is from your book between, you know, the USA and Australia, thousands of miles, massive great oceans, because code breaking and understanding where enemy forces are and what they're doing is an integral part of the Operation Vengeance story. Now, I know you said you're not a military historian, so we're not going to go into the practicalities and exactly the effectiveness of the code breaking, but the US Navy has magic, doesn't it? Which is their ability to intercept and break Japanese codes that are being sent around the Pacific Theater. So let's get towards 1943. So what happens in 1943? There's a day at the office. These cryptologists are sitting, listening traffic, and they pick up what? What do they pick up, Dick?
Well, shockingly, and it's Red Laswell, one of the legendary code breakers, at Station Hypo in Hawaii. He's got the night duty, and what comes across his desk is Yamamoto's flight itinerary for an upcoming trip within a matter of days. I think Laswell, they get it at Station Hypo, I think on April 13th, and Yamamoto is due to fly out that Palm Sunday, 5 days and counting. And shockingly, it's a detailed itinerary of his island hopping plans from one base to another that Yamamoto has decided to undertake to help shore up the morale of the men on the front lines. Because by April of 1943, things have begun to turn and go horribly wrong from the Japanese perspective. They've lost Guadalcanal, and in April, and it was a bloodbath in late 42 and into early 43, where the Japanese abandoned Guadalcanal. But in April, Yamamoto wanted to launch yet another attack, and especially at the Henderson Field and the American base to try to really cripple it. And as part of that, to work up he did that in early April, and the Americans were ready. But then he's going on this trip to, and in Hawaii they get the itinerary, and that sets in motion, in a real fast way, both the big decision of do we take on a targeted kill? Do we put our code breaking capabilities at risk? We know his itinerary. But what do we do with it? And we have to figure it out fast. And if we decide to do it, we got to figure out how to do it. And all that is, amazing. I mean, climactic drama intensity that I almost couldn't keep up with just reading about it and researching it, because you get really worked up, going from Hawaii into the Discovery first, the code breakers realizing what they have. This is radioactive. This is dynamite. And then having it with Admiral Nimitz and getting him informed. Look what we have. What do we do with it? Do we take someone out? Is that in terms of the rules of war? Do you target an opposing leader? There was concern about that. The ethics of war. There was certainly concern about, again, anytime you learn something, as you well know, having done so many of these shows, if you act on it, you put at risk that the enemy will discover that you've broken the code. And I don't think it can be overstated how valuable in the Pacific the code breaking piece had been in sort of America's comeback from being bludgeoned at Pearl Harbor, and only in the past few decades, I think, and again in my review and reading of history, has the importance of the code breaking really begun to emerge as such a pivotal factor in the war. Because of course, for a lot of reasons, it's always been shrouded in secrecy. A lot of good reasons, but the code breakers played a huge role. Um,
Yeah, and I think just before we move on with this, I think we now just step back, and we've talked about it already, but just consider Yamamoto's status in Japan in 1943 and his status in the USA, because we're looking at it today in 2021, where we've got a perhaps more balanced view of things, and it's it's a long time in the past. Because of the way the Japanese revere their leaders, Yamamoto is almost godlike status in there. I mean, and that's why when things are, as you said there, they're starting to turn against the Japanese in the Pacific theater now. So whether Yamamoto has a good plan or not for what to do about that, the fact he's going out there to tour air bases and visit people, that's a huge deal. If you're a Japanese airman on an island or a Japanese sailor and Yamamoto arrives, it's akin to the most important person in the world arriving at your base. So we can't underestimate how important he is to the Japanese. And of course, conversely, you touched on it earlier, in the USA, he is considered the nemesis of Pearl Harbor. He is considered the maestro, the evil genius. We could go down a rabbit hole discussing the way that the Japanese are portrayed in the media. There's lots of imagery used about how evil they are. So yeah, we can see 2021 that things were a little bit more nuanced, but at the time, Yamamoto is an incredibly influential figure, and which is why it ends up being discussed at a high level. So the code is intercepted, the message is intercepted, and as you say, there Nimitz is told about it. Now, some reports on the internet say that Nimitz even went as far as FDR to get permission to go. You don't hold with that, do you?
No, I didn't see that. I didn't come across that. I didn't uncover any new evidence of that. And in fact, and not that he wouldn't have been reachable, but he wasn't even in DC at that moment. And the best that I can tell and portray it is that it really ended up being Nimitz's call.
Yeah. But Nimitz does speak to Admiral Halsey. He does speak to his friend Halsey to for kind of counsel. And I feel this is an interesting angle, because Nimitz to me doesn't seem to be the sort of person who needs to get advice for tactically. He's a very confident military leader. But as you said a minute ago, this isn't the question is this a legitimate military target? Is going after a Japanese admiral, is that the conventional way to win a war? Is this and someone said, we've got David O'Keefe watching, by the way, Dick, who's a very famous Canadianist and written a lot about cryptology. And David is saying to ask you later on whether you think there's any parallel in the US quest to get Yamamoto to the Bin Laden situation we had a few years ago. I can see his point there, where someone attains a status where all the rules go out the window.
Yeah, no, I think that's history echoing itself. I think this is at the Yamamoto, and one of its, I think it's one among many pieces. What makes it so significant is that it was a targeted kill at a time when that was fairly novel. It wasn't unique, but it was very novel and gave pause. Whereas, again, in the age of terrorism and the war on terrorism, targeted kills have become kind of a key part of the U.S. playbook. Not just Osama bin Laden, but it's the drones and that kind of thing has really that's really changed in terms of the attitudes. I mean, that really hung up. I mean, Red Laswell himself later wrote about, because he was part of breaking the code that led to the Midway, which was a disaster for Japan and a huge victory for America. Just a year, 12 months to the month of the Yamamoto mission. And he felt great exhilaration, satisfaction over that. But Red Laswell, having, deciphered the Yamamoto itinerary and the prospect that they were going to go after him, he had mixed feelings about it. So it's kind of the mixed feelings was a thread through the whole process. And they were happy to hand it, up the chain of command and let it land on Nimitz's desk to have to make the call on whether to go at it, because it wasn't typical. But all the factors, as you said, you cannot underestimate how much he was hated in America. You can't overstate how much he was hated in America. He seemed to be the epitome. America, I mean, again, in Guadalcanal, you read about the diaries and read about the Marines fighting the Japanese. They really distinguish. I mean, the racism or the difference between fighting Japs versus fighting Nazis, they, is remarkable. That there was deep-rooted hatred towards the Japanese enemy, and I think Yamamoto was the epitome of that. Captured that being the Pearl Harbor guy, and then, like you say, in Japan, boy, in sports they talk about a player's coach, a player's manager. Yamamoto had that quality about him. I mean, he was beloved by his men because of gestures like that, showing up at a base or during when a big mission was taking off, he'd be at the airport saluting them off, kind of thing. There was a humanity about him that spread beyond the military to the people. Yeah. Where he was a complete rock.
And it was a respect not based on fear. I mean, when you read about the Japanese in World War II, you do get a sense of some of their respect for their leaders was out of fear. But Yamamoto, it seems to be much more based on affection and genuine respect and almost warmth towards him as well. Right. And then conversely, as we said, the USA hate him. There's this, he is the architect of Pearl Harbor. So we can understand how this was a very, very big decision. But of course, ultimately the decision is made that it is a legitimate target, and they've got, as you said, 4 or 5 days to put this together. So the code breaking had told the Allies that Yamamoto was visiting Rabaul there. So I've got the map there, and we have Henderson Airfield in Guadalcanal. So he's potentially close enough to do something about. But when we're talking about close in the Pacific, we're still talking hundreds of miles. So right. This is a high risk operation. How are we going to do it? What are the risks? And the point is, when you've worked out that, you've got to put this plan together very, very quickly. So tell us a little bit about how the plan was put together.
Well, once Nimitz, sort of let's do it, gives the green light, and as you say, confers with Halsey, who is stationed at New Caledonia in charge of the of the men in the Pacific. They really need to know, okay, what are the logistics? How are we going to pull this off? And then it lands in Pete Mitcher's lap on Guadalcanal, who's in charge of Guadalcanal. And it ultimately lands in John Mitchell's lap. And the reasons for that is it has to do with the planes, the fighter planes. When they figure out, as you said, with showing the map, Bougainville is how far away it is, 400 miles or so from Henderson Field in Guadalcanal, the Fighter 2 strip. Everyone, not surprisingly, and to the credit, all the services went in on it. The Marines went in on it, the Navy, but it becomes the Air Force mission and John Mitchell's, because they're at that moment flying the new P-38 Lightning. And so the P-38 Lightning, in my mind, becomes a character in the book, in the story, because that's only been in battle, in combat, in commission since in the Pacific since December, or not even 5 months.
5 months, yeah.
And it has been a game changer. And right away, when it arrived in December, John Mitchell and his fighter, they had to rotate through. They didn't have enough. But they began flying the P-38s. They were faster. They climbed faster and higher. The cone of fire, as they described it, being able to shoot straight ahead out of this, the cone of the plane. They learned on the job how to fly these P-38s, and it was the only plane that had a shot at making it to Bougainville and back, with the additional fuel added from belly tanks. But they were the only plane that could do it. And so, and John Mitchell being he was the first in his group to be, an ace pilot, and the number of kills he had. And he became the mission commander, and he was, with the help of others, handpicked. Initially, it was 18 pilots for 18 planes, but it ended up being 16 after 2 planes had trouble getting off of Guadalcanal. So it's this Friday afternoon, late Friday afternoon. The intercept of the code, the message was like Wednesday. Friday afternoon, it works its way to Henderson Field, where Pete Mitchell, the commander there, summons Mitchell to what they call the opium den, which is the commander's thing, and he explains they have a mission for him, to get Yamamoto, and it's Friday night, and it's going to happen Sunday morning. Pick your men, map out your flight route and your plan, and get going. And so the clock is ticking, and again, the drama continues, the tension escalates.
And just to jump in here, this is where you found out some information from the letters that hadn't been used before, because there has been some debate in previous books and articles as to whether or not these pilots were told their target was Yamamoto, or whether they were just told it was a target of a certain number of aircraft. But for you're saying from John Mitchell's letters, it's fairly clear they knew their target was Yamamoto.
Yeah, I mean, they were at that initial meeting. That's what Mitchell learned. It's in his own written materials. It's also the way when he talked about it years later on some video interviews that have never been seen before. It was information that was supposed to be closely held. Again, given the stakes, given the concern about code breaking. There's lots of talks about how a cover story that they're going to need, if indeed it all works out, because the Japanese, they fully expect, or they're going to wonder, how the hell did the Americans, know that Yamamoto was going to be going to Bougainville and blow him away? So they, put some thought into the cover story, but everyone was supposed to keep their lips sealed, but it didn't work. I mean, not only Mitchell's letters, but some of the other men's letters and diaries that I've seen. It became kind of an open secret by the time the mission was, Palm Sunday came around and the mission was executed. That you don't come home from a mission like that and have, a standing ovation, on the ground at Henderson Field if everyone doesn't have some sense of the enormity of it. It wasn't a routine mission by any means.
No, but this is interesting as well, but because later on there is some issues of when the mission is successful, some of the pilots going on furlough and leave and chatting a bit too much about it, because obviously they were very proud of this. And so Yamamoto is on Rabaul. Here he is. These are the last known photos taken of Yamamoto, where he's visiting in his white naval uniform there. He's visiting pilots. So you can only imagine the effect that's happening on the Japanese on that island there. And he's going to be taken off in a force of 6 aircraft. There's two bombers that are being used for transport, and escorts of Zeros, and they're going to be flying off. And as you say, what's really interesting is the fact that this, not only do they give Mitchell the plan of putting together the operation, they have to concoct some kind of cover story, because how on earth would a random flight of P-38s that far away from their base stumble upon something with such precise timing? So their cover story was Australian coastal watchers had somehow heard about it or seen this, and that's I find that a weird cover story to try and make the Japanese believe. We'll come on to what happens after the event and whether the Japanese realize their intercepts are being broken. But to me, that seems a very unpolished cover story. What's your feeling about that?
Yeah, no, I think it is, and actually had floated a couple of competing cover stories, like trial balloons or something. Because the one at the Americans, the other one that they had going, and the one that was that, and this was why secrecy was so paramount post mission, was the Americans were going to act like this was a kind of a routine mission, and they just by chance stumbled onto Yamamoto, and there was this aerial combat. And they downed some planes, but the Americans were supposed to act like they had no idea that Yamamoto was in the plane, and complete ignorance, which is why it was so important, again, to keep it secret. And there was I think there was some validity to trying to float that one, because just a few weeks earlier, Mitchell, and it was Mitchell, had taken they were protecting some bombers, had gone up to Bougainville, so they'd been in that area. So it wasn't beyond belief that the Americans could be in that area, which is one of the reasons why Yamamoto's advisors kept telling him, don't go to Rabaul, don't be going down there. This is getting too close to the flame. It's too unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. So you have that on the Japanese side, and you have the Americans that were in the area. If they could shoot him down, they know what they got, thinking. But if they could keep the lid on it and go silent and go quiet on everything, they might be able to get away with, how they really knew. And the Japanese wouldn't suspect it. So that was, I think, to me, the better possibility in terms of a cover story.
I think also worth touching on is the Japanese worry about him being shot down, but Yamamoto kind of dismissing it, because there's interesting parallels with Field Marshal Rommel in Normandy a year later, who was taking transport. People saying you shouldn't be taking staff cars through Normandy. Allies got fighters everywhere. I wonder whether there's a thing where if you're a leader of men and you are supremely confident and you are supremely loved by your men, you do get to a point where a little bit of arrogance and hubris kind of kicks in a bit, and you believe you're untouchable. You believe that it won't happen to me. I'm immortal. And do you think in your study of Yamamoto, by this point of the war, he's a little bit of that way in thinking?
Probably, yeah. I think there is something to that. It's all part of who he is. And even and to me, there's this wonderful quote, again from various memoirs and stuff like that, quoting Yamamoto when one of his, at the last minute saying, don't go. And Yamamoto can't imagine not going. And he just simply says, I've told them I'm coming. It's like he's given them his word that he's made that choice. There's no revisiting it. There's no going back. And I think that's about keeping his word, and about a little bit, I think, of what you said, described about these, big leaders. It's part of their makeup. They're going to the front line and follow through. They can't imagine saying, okay, I better not go. It might be too rough down there, putting myself at risk.
And also he would maybe undermine a little bit his own reputation. His men do love him, and if in one of these bases he's not turning up because he's a bit worried about the enemy fighters, people might say, what, Yamamoto worried about enemy fighters? What's happening? So he's kind of made a rod for his own back, in a sense, by being so loved, and his men believe him to be so supremely good at what he does that he's kind of committed. As you said, he's made a promise to be there, and he's kind of got to see it through. So let's come to the mission.
He's made the date. He can't stand up his date. He can't do that. Yeah.
And that's, and we could go down a whole rabbit hole about leaders committing to things that end up, things going badly wrong. There's that, again, the hubris and pride and arrogance comes into it. But let's talk about, we don't want to go too much down the aviation angle, because there's lots of great stuff on YouTube about the flight dynamics and exactly what types of drop tanks they used. Dick is a human historian. He's a journalist, so we know. I don't want to go into too much details of that aircraft, of the aviation aspect. But at the same time, the flight plan was there's a lot. It's a lot of things can go wrong. And I'm interested that John Mitchell he requested a Navy compass to use in his aircraft because he thought they were better than the Army ones. Right. So they have tried to do everything they can to ensure this works, because we're going back to navigation by compass over oceans. If you're only half a degree out and you're traveling hundreds of miles, the potential error is huge, isn't it? We've got people like Tome from the Philippines, one of my regular viewers is watching. He's a pilot. In fact, he said he was inspired to become a pilot years ago because of this story. So he's been waiting for this show for a long time. So, in your studying of the correspondence and the pilots, how much do you think these pilots go into this knowing this is a really, really tough flying mission? Do they really realize just how many things they have to get right for this to work?
Yes. Time and again, not only, again, in Mitchell's own accounts, during and after, but certainly of the other pilots who have been interviewed and written memoirs or letters that I've gotten a hold of, they knew the enormity, the gravity, the importance of it. right from the get-go when they met outside, where they had their tents on a hillside at the fighter strip 2, which is where the P-38s took off from. And as Mitchell had stayed up, all Saturday and into Saturday night working out the flight route, with information from a bunch of different people, his flight pad and, doing the math and, flight speed for the P-38, the distance and whatnot, and coming up with the map, I love it, shows these 5 legs that would get them out of Guadalcanal, but then would take them around all these islands as they work their way north to Bougainville, needing to stay away from the coast, to be just out over the open water at a very low, altitude. So they were just above the ocean, but staying away from the coastline to be out beyond the view of any possible coastal watchers for the Japanese. And as you say, using the compass, that's why the title of the book became Dead Reckoning. It was, it was about dead reckoning in terms of the flight path and whatnot. But he came up with a route, and there were so many factors. What if they ran into a tropical storm, along the way? What if the idea was to come up with a route that would, and they had Yamamoto's itinerary, and they're assuming correctly that Japanese admiral will be meticulous about being on time. So coming up with a flight route that would bring them sort of to intercept Yamamoto as he's starting his descent into Bougainville. But what if Yamamoto was slightly delayed? What if like I said, there's a storm? What if the wind speed that he was using in his calculations? What if the winds just picked up? If there were changes, all these what ifs. It was huge. Talk about long odds and a roll of the dice. This seemed to be it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I tweeted today about the show coming up, and someone made a comparison to some other flight, amazing bits of flying in World War II. And the interesting thing was, someone came up with the idea is that the very best bits of flying in World War II is where the guy who plans the mission is also leading the flight. You have sometimes in World War II where senior officers give the information to the air crews, and it's been worked out by someone else. But it seems to me the very best missions are when the guy who's actually going to fly it is responsible for the planning of it. I'm thinking of Major John Howard, the British glider infantry leader in Normandy, bringing the gliders into Pegasus Bridge. I'm thinking about Guy Gibson, Victoria Cross, the Dam Busters raid. If you're flying the mission yourself, it is in your own survival's interest to get that mission worked out. The interesting thing in this case is it's done in 3 or 4 days. When we compare it to some of these other acts of precision flying, these were planned over weeks, if not months. This is a few days to put something together, which I think is absolutely exceptional.
Well, it's even less than a few days, because he gets the assignment on a Saturday and they're in the air on Sunday.
Okay, so 24 hours, which is, I mean, okay, they've been in theater, they know a bit about the aircraft, although they've only been using it for a few months. They know the basics of navigation and air combat. But again, that if they get there and Yamamoto's flight is 10 minutes behind, they can't just circle around for 10 minutes. They haven't got enough fuel. It is so many things dependent on this.
Fuel. I forgot to mention the fuel. Yes.
Okay, yes. So, I mean, and that's where we have to, I think, bring it back to just what this success would have meant to the USA. And okay, we now know it was successful, but I suppose at the higher level, the reason the Nimitz commits to this is if the worst thing happens and 18 pilots don't come back from this, it probably was still worth the risk, simply because of the potential of killing Yamamoto once they've made that decision. So it's terrible for those families, but in the enormity of the Pacific campaign, it is a gamble worth taking, until we come to the whether or not the Japanese would have understood we could detect their codes, which we will talk about a little bit later on. But in terms of the risk of the men who could be killed in this operation, I suppose it was a risk worth taking.
Yeah, I think, and again, that's the kind of, the courage and the bravery, and I sort of became in awe of that, because everyone wanted in on it. It wasn't like, oh my God, because no one, quite frankly, no one expected to come back.
Yeah.
because of, again, whether it was the fuel, but in large part because, yeah, they were sending up 18 P-38s under Mitchell's command. They fully expected Yamamoto would have 50 planes surrounding him on a flight like this, on a trip like this. Especially the legendary Zeros and stuff like that, the fighter Zeros, and they had basis for that. Secretary of Defense Frank Knox had just a few in the winter of 43, late winter, had visited the South Pacific, had come to Guadalcanal, and given the unpredictable and the wartime tumult, they had gone out and escorted him into Guadalcanal with 30, 40 planes to protect him. So it was almost, it made sense that they were going to be trying to take out Yamamoto as he's surrounded and protected by dozens of planes and whatnot. And yet everyone stepped up and wanted to be part of it and wanted Mitchell to pick them. And that's kind of jaw dropping in its.
It is, although I suppose some of it connects to the fighter pilot is a interesting breed. They are a warrior on their own. It's not like you're part of a ground, on the ground you're part of an infantry platoon or you're part of a tank crew or a bomber crew even. When you're a fighter pilot, there is this single-mindedness about them. Some they are a little bit perhaps arrogant, and I mean that in a good way. Think of the fighter pilot veterans I've met over the years. There is a level of supreme confidence and cockiness,
right?
And they believe in their luck as well. That's interesting because it's just come up in the sidebar about one thing you can't plan for is just luck, and they did end up with quite a lot of luck that day. And as you said, the Japanese didn't put as many aircraft in the air to protect Yamamoto's fight as they could have done. There ended up not being a tropical storm. The navigation did kind of work okay, and so but you can't, when you're planning a mission, you can't plan on luck happening. You can hope it's going to, but there's no way you can incorporate that into your kind of report, your feasibility study, if you like.
And Mitchell certainly realized, afterwards that had been his really lucky day. The other quality of character about Mitchell that I came away so impressed about was not only did he map out a flight plan that proved to be successful, at the end of the day, but there was a selflessness about him that just sort of knocked me back a little bit. I mean, the mission was that they're designating a kill flight of 4 pilots who, once they intercepted Yamamoto, they would go in for the kill. Well, the remaining P-38s would fend off the Zeros, provide cover so that they could accomplish the targeted kill. Johnny Mitchell, and I'm sure there were pilots who would have done this, could have, he was an ace. He was one of the best pilots in Guadalcanal. He could have designated himself as one of the killer flight. Instead, being, again, mission commander, the planner of the route and everything else, part of that in his mind was protecting the killer flight. So he picked 4 pilots to do that. And he took the role of responsibility of protecting them and making sure they can complete the mission. And again, it's in the ensuing, whether there was controversy or not, that's kind of where the glory was. Who shot down Yamamoto, not who came up with the flight plan or who flew, another few thousand feet up looking out for Zeros and trying to pick them off to create a safer space for the fighter pilots. I just thought that was leadership at its best.
Yeah, and leadership is so vital in these things. And I think with another little thing that came up in the sidebar as well, Tone is saying that, of course, because they only had 24 hours, they're up all night planning this. They're up all night going through their checks, going through everything. So when they do this operation, and it was going to be incredibly taxing on their minds, and bodies, just to forget about the risk of the mission, just the physical toll and the mental toll on flying for that thing with the furthest, the longest distance fighter intercept mission of World War II. Right. When they get there, they're going to be mentally and physically exhausted, and they've got to fly their way back.
And hot as hell. They're flying so low above the water. There's no ventilation. They were flying in sauna baths, which could make you, delirious, probably.
Which does explain when you get to I'll let you tell about the unfolding of the mission in a minute, but why there is a difference of opinion about those last few moments. The key moment of actually honing in on aircraft, you can understand when pilots were debriefed. And we should mention the fact that on Guadalcanal airfield, there was no official debriefing process at that time of the war. There wasn't enough infrastructure. It's so remote, these islands, that the number of support staff at these airfields is so minimal. They don't, like pilots in the ETO, get back from mission and go straight into a debrief when an intelligence officer goes through everything they did. That didn't happen in the Pacific, which I find remarkable. Or it didn't happen at that point of the Pacific in that airfield. So it does make you understand when people started to talk about this later, there are some discrepancies about who did what and what happened on that. But let's tell in your own words how the kind of flight took off and the key moments from your point of view.
Well, they didn't run into any storms and what it was almost by the book, by the flight plan, and Mitchell, felt an enormous amount of relief when they reached their final destination on the last leg on time, according to plan. But then came this sort of existential pause because there was this bright blue sky but nothing else in it except it's almost this like time is suspended there for a moment because Yamamoto's supposed to be here too, but very quickly that passes when one of the other pilots, Doug Canning, shouts bogeys 11 o'clock 10 o'clock, and they look up and they see in the distance the enemy's planes, and Mitchell was so pumped up, and they were flying so low, and then they start their ascent to meet them, and he instructs the 4 killer pilots. There's Tom Lamphere, there's Rex Barber, there's Besby Holmes, and Ray Hine to go get him, the action begins. I really try to in my narrative is to really slow it down and combine all the variety of resources, whether it's letters or diaries, but all the existing literature on this, and really bring it down to what we call a tick-tock, to have it hopefully unfold in its full dramatic glory, so to speak. And Besby Holmes and Ray Hine, they have trouble because they need to get rid of their belly tanks to be able to maneuver properly. Besby Holmes has trouble getting rid of his, so they have to peel off to one side to go out over the water while he tries to shake loose. Mitch is a little frustrated by that, but storming ahead is Rex Barber and Tom Lamphere, and that's where the controversy in the narrative begins. As to who actually shot Yamamoto. I think by now I think it's a settled matter. Frankly, I think the weight of the evidence over time, and this involves trips to the site. People have done studies, all kinds of studies and whatnot. And I think Lamphere did some amazing stuff because he took on some of the Zeros that once they spotted these 2 P-38s coming towards the Betty bombers, they're one holding Yamamoto and one holding a top official. They dove to attack the P-38s, and Lamphere went right into them to take them on. And Barber was the one who was firing away at the Betty bombers and the one holding Yamamoto. I think Lamphere looped back into it a little bit, but again, from everything I read and studied, and again by historians and military minds, far sharper than mine, I think the jury has come in that it was Rex Barber who really took him out.
Although, and I'm with you on that. Although, as we said at the top of the show, does it really matter? The point is, all of the 18 of these pilots and the ground crews are all part of this victory. And David O'Keefe keeps reminding us, all this is only possible because of those work guys spending their shifts listening to naval intercepts from the Japanese to put this information to in the first place. So sure, someone is actually behind the stick and actually presses the button that brings down Yamamoto's plan. But like with everything else in World War II, they are part of a much greater team and a much more wider group of people. And I do stress to people watching this show is that we're only covering the main points tonight. The link is in the description below to buy Dick's book online because it's a cracking read. And as you said, you'll get the whole mission minute by minute, but all slowed down to such a point where you can understand where each aircraft is in the sky, and it all gets explained for you much more than we can fit in this hour we've got talking about today. So I urge you to go and do that. But it is successful. They shoot down the two Betty bombers, one with Yamamoto in Bougainville, and they get back to the airfield. Tell us what happened when they get back to the airfield, because David O'Keefe is questioning again why, if this is so important, there wasn't more recording of this, why there aren't intelligence people there getting the exact versions of this. Because you can find them on YouTube, folks. There are films made in World War II, U.S. Army Air Force films, where they're using camera footage from other missions and things like that. But for something like this, do you think there was a little bit of a haphazard approach to recording it?
Oh, absolutely. I think that therein lies, sort of that initial sort of chaos and lack of, a thorough process or debriefing that allows for, these competing accounts to take hold. Which is a shame, like I say, and because as I said earlier on, it feels like, because what does it really, in the end, too much oxygen is spent on figuring out who actually, shot Yamamoto and stuff like that. And I wanted to, minimize that and maximize the bigger picture, the broader team, the how they got there to that moment, that involved all kinds of people in the services in Guadalcanal. But yeah, so that was a little surprising, and so the first report that is written, which had Tom Lanfear's, was a big contributor to that, because he was the first one back, and he started to establish his view of things, which was off-putting as a reader, someone like, why can't you wait until everyone's back? And it was certainly off-putting to the other pilots as they returned and learned that Tom Lanfear was claiming credit for getting Yamamoto. And there was a huge turnout on the airfield because, again, they knew what was going on. It was not a very well kept secret at that point. And so the first official report, had the counts wrong on the number of planes down, and who did what. And so there were initially some hard feelings. And then once again, hard feelings in that moment. It's almost like, Rex Barber went at it, with Lanfear a little bit. And Mitchell was surprised that, again, this is in hindsight, that Tom Lanfear was asserting himself as the one who got Yamamoto. But once again, Mitchell, I think, displays some of that special leadership quality, because he basically calls a timeout. And he basically says, it doesn't matter. We got him,
yeah,
kind of thing. Stop. And they end up sort of following suit. And in some ways it plays to Lanfear's advantage, because his story takes root, and it takes a long time for it to uproot. But the point is that they are able to stop in that moment, and they party hard into the night at Henderson Field. And one of the great war correspondents, Mac Morris, wrote about that, hearing the noises coming from the Fighter II strip, where these, the P-38 pilots, were carrying on and celebrating, while also acknowledging the loss of one of their own, Ray Hine, who didn't come back.
Yeah, and I think we should mention the fact we do lose Ray Hines on this. Is the only victim of this mission. Of course, some of the other pilots were involved in other things later in the war, but on this flight in Operation Vengeance, Ray Hines was the only one who lost his life, and he was one of the 4 attack aircraft. And yet, given the risks of this, one pilot lost. He's absolutely amazingly successful.
Yes, and especially when they all took off, earlier that Sunday morning, again to a man, they had to be wondering whether any of them would come back.
Yeah, and yet we are in some ways. Although I like the your writing about the flight itself, it's the aftermath that I find in many ways more interesting, because you've got several things going on. So the first thing is the Japanese, how they report, or if they report Yamamoto's death, because they've lost a figurehead for in theater. Then there's how the Americans release the information, and then there's will the Japanese realize that we are breaking their codes, because the pinpricking of this to get our flight there, the chances of that being random are 1,000,000 to 1 against. So this is the aftermath. So the first thing that happened, let's look about the Japanese point of view. So what happens when they realize Yamamoto's dead? Because I mean, the Japanese got to the crash site, I think the next day, didn't they? And there were bullet hits to his body. They think he was hit by bullets in the air,
yes.
Not the crash itself. He was already dead in the air.
Yeah, he had bullet holes, in his head and the shoulder and whatnot. And the one in the head was definitely a fatal hit. It's days. Initially, it's a military secret.
Yeah.
And they're mourning and they're in shock, and they're then trying to assess, the impact on public opinion, on the public, which they know is not going to be good. So they sit on it, for a while before they break the news, and how to break the news. And it's in that interval, during that waiting period, that the Americans, from their perspective, know, and they can't gloat, they can't say anything or do anything to suggest knowing that they had gotten Yamamoto, because that puts at risk, like, how would they know, and if not for breaking their code, so there's enormous pressure on the American side, because the word was out, to keep the lid on it, while they waited for Japan to acknowledge what the Americans knew. I mean, at the highest level, not generally speaking. And when they did finally announce it in Japan, they described Yamamoto fighting to his death, war hero moment. And the nation mourned. It was, again, reading the coverage of that and the funeral, it was probably the equivalent feeling for them as the day that JFK was shot in Dallas.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, they make the best of it, don't they? In a sense, I'm reminded again the parallel with Field Marshal Rommel, who we now know it was the Gestapo, the SS, who kind of ordered him to commit suicide, and yet the Germans give him a state funeral. They on the one hand, they're getting rid of him, but on the other hand, they're still using his funeral to push their own agenda. There's this sense of it can boost the morale of the public. So I think the Japanese kind of, well, he's dead, what's the best way we can handle this? And I suppose by having a massive, great funeral like this, you're immortalizing him. You're making him kind of almost a martyr for the cause, in a sense, so that he can still metaphorically lead from beyond the grave. So that they're doing the best they can,
and try to turn it into an inspirational moment.
Yeah. And yet, from the American side, some of the pilots go on leave, they go to Australia, and they chat a bit too much, and more of the story gets out than people really wanted. And it ends up with Admiral Halsey calling some of these guys in and absolutely, throwing the book at them, which is an amazing. They've just accomplished one of the most precision flying acts of World War II, and yet they've ended up getting in trouble over it. But explain a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, no, I love, again, bringing this moment alive, because it involves an Associated Press journalist, Norman Lodge, war correspondent. And anytime there's a moment of journalism, that's one where I really, zero in on here. And this is where I feel, John Mitchell, again, suffered tragically for the misdeeds of others. What happened was, after it, again, they had to keep their mouths shut, or that's what the plan was. Mitchell is actually on his way back to the States. Meanwhile, Rex Barber and Tom Lamphere, again, two heroic pilots on this mission, are off to New Zealand for some, some chill out time. And Norman Lodge, a good reporter as he is picking up, again, what has been not a very well kept secret in the Pacific, that something, good is happening, Yamamoto and all that whole stuff. So he's reporting this, and he gets Barber and Lanphier to go on a round of golf, and Lodge gets them to open up, Lanphier especially, a chatterbox about the mission and about getting Yamamoto. Lodge has a hell of a story. And this is only within a week of the kill. But the story has to go through censors, and it crosses Bull Housley's desk, who explodes, perhaps understandably. And what's at stake, or one of the things he does in response, is that the paperwork is on his desk for Mitchell to get the president the Medal of Honor, and for the other guys to get, again, I don't remember exactly what the medals are, but just, high honors, right?
Yeah, they were recommended for the Medal of Honor, and in the end, they got the Navy Cross. And the Navy Cross is an incredible award to receive, and they've still done their job. But there was a theory they were going to get the absolute highest award, but it's the intervention of the Admiral that.
And Mitchell's not even there. And Mitchell's the one who's, he's really in line for a Medal of Honor. He's written his wife Annie Lee. This is what he's told is in the works. And Bull Housley calls in brings them down to New Caledonia and just reams them out. And with them in the office, he said, "You guys should be court-martialed." And he takes all that paperwork and he just rips it up. And so they've gone, as you said, they've done this historic and heroic mission, and now are being threatened with, by Housley, that they become war criminals of sorts.
Yeah. And this is where, as a Brit, I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate here. And David O'Keefe is reminding in the sidebar, because Winston Churchill in the ETO, we've been able to intercept German messages for some time now. And Churchill was a little bit annoyed about post-Midway, the Americans explaining how some of the information they got about that was because of code breaking. Now there's this incident, and it's, they didn't actually specifically mention code breaking, but it was like, will people put two and two together? And this is where, again, being devil's advocate, I can completely understand Yamamoto's reputation. I can completely understand why sending this mission to bring about his end was considered to be very important. But whether in the grand scheme of things, when there's a war to win with a chess game where you're moving your pieces incrementally, and I'm reminded of that sequence in The Imitation Game, which I know is a bit of a silly movie because it does condense all the activities of the Bletchley Park, but it's not so much the breaking of the code, is how can we act on breaking the code so to not give away to the Germans, the enemy, that we are breaking their code. And this potentially means we lose our ace. The ace we had in the Pacific, and we must remind ourselves, in mid-1943, the war has not yet completely gone our favor. We've just got Guadalcanal, but there's lots of tough fights to come.
Balance still. Yeah.
So was this all a little bit hastily put together? And not just put together, but the fact that afterwards to put a lid on it properly. And David O'Keefe again is mentioning why there weren't more people there from the main suits with the microphones, say, just making sure these guys didn't go and talk anybody, making sure they were debriefed, put them into a bubble for 3 months if some, just make sure they are kept out of the way. But amazingly, and here's the all's well that ends well moment, is to the best of the knowledge of people who studied codes, the Japanese never worked out during the whole of World War II we were able to break their codes. And so the secret was kept. And I was reading today about why this is code breaking experts, and they had basically put it down to everything that the Japanese were picking up should have told them that we were able to intercept what they were saying. And the only reason they can come up with as to why they never realized that is hubris. It's pride again. It's arrogance, and they can't possibly read our codes. We're fine. And the Allies got away with it. So I say all's well that ends well, I think, is the right way to consider this, in that it did bring about the death of Yamamoto. The Allies only lost one pilot, and we didn't give away to the enemy that we could break their codes. But not that we do the counterfactuals too often. You do have to wonder what might have happened on another day.
Yeah. No, I think there are instances and evidence where you would think the Japanese should have figured it out.
Yeah.
And they didn't. And I think the only explanation can be that hubris that you mentioned, because they suppressed that story that Norman Lodge was writing, but there was stuff leaking out, and it's almost like the hubris, they don't want to believe it, or something to be true. But yeah, and I think it also reinforces points we've made before, is how incredibly valuable the code breaking was in the Pacific.
Yeah.
That's again, I'm not sure to this day it's still gotten the attention and that it deserves in terms of the vital role that it played. Because I mean, Midway, I think, is Exhibit A. If somehow the Japanese had figured out before Midway, never mind Yamamoto, but my God, those are the kinds of operations and successes that were at risk if they ever found out. I mean, the Midway thing was just amazing.
Yeah, and this is the so the interesting thing about when we talk on World War II TV about these little differences is that the World War II, the victory in World War II was not any single event. It was thousands of events all happening, and a lot of it is simply things like resources and logistics. And yet the attention of the public is always on the exciting fighter missions and the commander operations and the parachute jumps and the spies. And actually, there's a whole lot of boring work going on behind the scenes, such as those who are doing the intelligence work that we don't talk about enough, although we do a bit on World War II TV as it goes. We do try and give those people their dues. And so I think we'll bring things to an end in a minute. But, at the end of this process, as a journalist, do you think you'll dive back into World War II again? Or is it kind of a once bitten to go back into other things? Where do you think you'll be with this?
I ended up, I don't know. I mean, I'm open to it. I mean, this, what I loved about this is I learned, on so many levels. One thing I love about being a journalist is being able to take a deep dive into something I perhaps didn't know much about beforehand, and then learn so much in so many surprising ways. And then there was that personal piece, is understanding better, my father and his service a little better in terms of context. Not that he was involved in Guadalcanal or anything like that, but I understood now a little bit more about his service, and I appreciated that. I don't know. I mean, it would be for me as a journalist. It starts with the story, and hearing something that that really sort of tickles me in that way and taps into that in that way. And one of another nice discovery as far as this kind of deep dive into the Pacific and Guadalcanal was once I started in on John Mitchell's life and his timeline and his chronology, I have to say it was such a for my purposes, it was so great to discover and to learn that when the Marines landed in Guadalcanal, in that August of 42 to start the American surge there, or Mitchell was there, was dropped in, came 2 or 3 weeks later. So I loved it, being able to, again, it wasn't the climax, of course, is the Yamamoto mission, but through John Mitchell, I'm able to work through the whole American presence in Guadalcanal and that fight in the fall and taking it and then repelling the Japanese and the Japanese. Mitchell's in it, as a pilot, but it just seemed another way into that history.
And of course, carries on. Korean War, a lot more service to go, a lot more service in World War II. And I think you're quite right. I think the attention has been on the people who did the fatal kills. And it should have been on the leader of the mission, because he seems to be the level head. He seems to be the pragmatist, the mind behind all this, and the solid presence behind it. And of course, when you read your book, you get that full fleshing out of his personality through his relationship with his wife. And I think that's all important. And I think, again, in your book, you talk about other people on the airfields. You link it, and there are. As a tour guide in Normandy, we meet people who say, yeah, my grandfather was in the Pacific. I didn't really know what he was doing, but he was out there. We have to remind ourselves that every single drop of drinking water that was taken to Iwo Jima or Guam or Saipan had to be brought by someone. All those transport ships was going back and forth across the ocean, just bringing drinking water. Now, they're not earning medals, they're not getting newspaper headlines, they're not getting books written about them, but they are as integral to this overall victory as the pilots themselves. And it's important that we acknowledge all of that contribution to World War II and the Pacific theater, because it's just enormous what was going on out there, and the commitments out there by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of personnel can never be forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, I think we'll bring things down there, Dick. I've really enjoyed it. I'll just remind people what we've got coming up in the next few days, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a moment. So tomorrow it's an early show, so it's 12:30 UK time, so just after lunch, because we've got guests from Brisbane, Dallas, me in France, and London. I think there's 4 guests. We're talking about Section 22 out of Australia. Then on Thursday, it's Stillwell's Road through Burma. That'll be a fantastic story. Then Friday, I've been really looking forward to this one. The incredible British historian Sol David is coming on to talk about the Crucible of Hell, the fighting on Okinawa. So some incredible shows he brought you this week. So as usual, don't forget to check us out on Patreon, share what we're doing on social media. Dick's website is in the description below. The description to buy Dick's book is in the description below. Check all that out. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much to Dick for joining us. Did you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, thanks. I learned a lot. And that's always a great thing.
Well, we learned as well, and you said it. You know, you're right about filling up an hour. We did 75 minutes in the end, so that's fantastic. So it's good. And if you do another World War II book, I will happily have you back on again because you know it was good, and I learned a lot, and our viewers learned a lot. So so thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
So thanks everybody. I will see you all again tomorrow for Section 22. Cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. Enjoy the rest of your day.